Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. Our guest today has been a leading voice in the economic case for managing climate change for a rather experienced level of time. In addition to authoring two landmark papers on climate change and Australia's future in 2008 and 2011, Ross Garnaut was the principal economic advisor to Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Australian ambassador to China from 1985 to 1988. Now Ross and former ACCC chair Rod Sims have launched the Superpower Institute, which is not a reference to the X-Men, but rather an institute designed to provide analysis to help Australia take advantage of the economic opportunities of a post-carbon world. Professor Ross Garnaut, thank you so much for joining us on The Greener Way.
Hello, Rachel. Very good to be with you.
Pleasure. Ross, as said, you've had an outsized influence on the economic and policy debate around climate change, while articulating the fact that managing climate change is key to maintaining and extending Australia's prosperity. How's the Superpower Institute driving that agenda?
Well, we want to change the narrative in Australia about dealing with climate change. When I did those two reports, first of all, for all the states, all the premiers, and the Prime Minister joined when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister. Then it was something we had to do because the cost of doing something was less than the cost of just living with the chaos of climate change. But then it looked as if it was some early cost for much bigger benefits later. What's changed in the years since then is it's become clear that even in the short term and very strongly in the long term, if Australia plays a leading role in building a zero-carbon economy and exporting zero-carbon goods to those countries that can't provide them easily for themselves, we can not only make a big contribution to dealing with the global problem of climate change, we can make ourselves prosperous. That is a change, and the role of the Superpower Institute is to explain that, undertake research to fill out the details of how it can be done, how it will work, what policies are needed, but also and importantly to explain the advantages to the Australian community.
It's an interesting distinction you make there between looking at managing the risks of climate change versus setting up the future prosperity of Australia in a post-carbon world. I mean, obviously, this isn't an either or. We're going to be managing the risks and impacts of climate change at the same time. But it's as you say, it's a very interesting evolution of the narrative of Australia's role in a post-carbon world, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And it's a very big role. It's a much bigger role than I was aware of when I did the very big report back in 2007 and 2008. All of the world is now committed to zero net emissions. Every member of the United Nations has signed up to the Paris and Glasgow commitments to keep climate change within 1.5 degrees. Scientists have explained, and the international community accepted, that means getting down to zero net emissions by 2050. Because some developing countries will take longer, that means all the developed countries will have to get there by 2045. China signed on and is doing a lot. India signed on, not doing quite so much yet, but very much aware that they have to. But the reality is that the densely populated and high-income industrial countries of Europe and Northeast Asia, and Northeast Asia is Japan, Korea, China, won't be able very easily to get there from their own resources. Australia's got very rich renewable energy resources, very rich sun, very rich wind, land to put these things. The best place in Germany for solar is worse than the west coast of Tasmania, which is the worst place in Australia. But even if Germany had just as good as sun and wind as us, or it doesn't, they're running out of room to put additional solar farms. So the cheapest way for them to get the last mile to zero will be to import goods that currently use a lot of coal or oil or gas, and we're the best place in the world for supplying them with those goods. So not only do we make ourselves prosperous by really getting behind this global transition, we make it possible for Europe and Northeast Asia to meet the commitments that they do want to meet, but they don't have the domestic resources to meet them.
So it's a 21st century spin on with golden soil and wealth for toil, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah.
Um, you and Rod Sims recently outlined your policy platform and sort of the driving themes for the Superpower Institute. What are those three big themes that you've identified to drive the transition to net zero while also driving new prosperity for Australia?
Well, first we have to define through research, our own and working with other people around Australia and internationally, define the opportunity. And that means research on how the cost of meeting carbon goals in other countries from their own resources and the costs in doing it in Australia, and therefore defining the gains that could be made for them and for us by exporting zero emissions goods made from our renewable energy or biomass. Secondly, we've got to undertake research on what's necessary to achieve this goal. Some of the obstacles are really in community understanding. We won't get there unless there's widespread community understanding and support and preparation for it. We need a heck of a lot of labour skills that we don't have now, and so young people have to recognize the opportunity and gear themselves up for it. They'll do very well out of it, but not if they don't know now the nature of the opportunity. And we've got to work through ourselves and then help explain to the Australian community how it will unfold over time, the economic policies that will be necessary to keep it going. So we'll be working on all of those fronts. But especially on analysing and explaining the very big advantage that Australia has and the very great difficulty a number of countries will have in getting early to net zero, and the good we do ourselves and them and the world's climate effort by really getting in the front row on making progress on these things.
Personally, as someone who's a political and policy wonk myself, the idea of developing a big narrative that's easily communicated and embedded in community is something I really have spent a lot of time thinking about. So I'm really resonating with this idea of building the understanding, the research, and then communicating it to all so that it's understandable and part of day-to-day lives.
Yeah, it's been an important part of my young career at the foot of the master. That was Bob Hawke's economic policy approach. You could do hard things in the public interest if everyone understood why you were doing it and the benefits of doing it. And so on all of the big changes that were made in the 80s, he would have made a dozen speeches everywhere in Australia explaining it, getting people ready for it before anything was done. And that made all the difference.
So you talked a little bit about some of the challenges facing Australia in the road ahead. But what are the big advantages that Australia has getting there, as well as some of those key blockages that you're hoping that you can help overcome through the work of the Superpower Institute?
Well, the skills and industrial culture and the legacy infrastructure from the old industries are actually very helpful in the new. We're the main source in the world for a lot of minerals used in industry. And the skills that make those industries work are going to be very useful in the new economy. The infrastructure, all those ports on the Queensland coast and in the Pilbara, but even the ports closer to the old cities, Port Kembla and Wollongong in New South Wales, Portland in Victoria, all the way up the Queensland coast, ports that initially were for wool and beef, and then they became important for coal, especially the ports between Gladstone and Townsville. That's all infrastructure that was built for a different purpose, but it will be very valuable for the new industries. So the physical infrastructure, the industrial culture. The people of regional Australia are used to these sorts of industries, heavy industries, big machines, electricity, wires, ports with boats going in and out. Try and do that in suburban Sydney or Melbourne and you'll be run out of town. But we don't have to do it where people don't want it. And the people of regional Australia actually like this sort of stuff.
So we can leverage the best of regional Victoria and those of us who live in the latte sipping, soy eating cultures down here in Melbourne.
Yeah. One very important lesson, Rachel, I think, message is that
yes,
no one has to have a solar farm on their land if they don't want it. We're a big country. Lots of people do want it. If the full opportunity is used, and we're providing a lot of the green iron, green aluminium, green silicon, green nitrogenous fertilizers to Europe and Japan and China and Korea, we'll need a heck of a lot of solar farms and wind turbines, but they'll only cover 0.5% of Australia, and there's plenty of people, including Indigenous Australians, who, so long as the arrangements are right for them, so long as they're able to have their full say in how things work and benefit from it, they're enthusiastic. So we don't have to put a solar farm in front of your latte shop in Brighton.
Well, and I think focusing as well on the just transition is the key to unlocking that prosperity as well. That's just a personal bias is mine, and people who've been above my paid grade have made excellent points around that as well.
Yes, it's absolutely crucial.
I wanted to focus on the role of government and public support as well, if we can, Ross. Obviously, Australia can't compete in gross terms with the Inflation Reduction Act out of the US at other countries or economic blocs, economic responses to climate change. How does Australia cleverly leverage what we can do without trying to chase something that's unaffordable and unrealistic?
Yeah. Well, the IRA, President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, that's what he calls that huge package of measures to accelerate decarbonisation. People don't like inflation, so he called it an Inflation Reduction Act.
Talk about messaging. That was actually down to one senator, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, I think, who came up with that title and got him on board.
Yeah. Well, however it got its name, it's playing a very useful role in decarbonising America. It will greatly accelerate the reduction of emissions and the growth of the zero carbon industry of America. But we don't have to compete with it because the way they are going about things with a big budget deficit, by far the biggest budget deficit in history outside the wars, and they're doing it in a protectionist way. They're making it cheap to buy a car with a big electric car with a big subsidy, but the car has to be made in America, and Volkswagen from Germany or Toyota from Japan, even if it's got zero emissions and superb technology, won't get much of a look in. But because it's protectionist and because it's funded by these huge budget deficits, it's raising the cost structure inside the United States. So it works for decarbonising America. But America won't be supplying zero carbon goods to the rest of the world partly because the IRA makes it uncompetitive. And in the rest of the world, competitive in America, but not in the rest of the world. And so we don't have to compete with that. We have to do our own thing. There's a big role for government, essentially three big things that only government can do. In economist terms, markets don't work if firms are able to impose costs on others from what they do without penalty. So we actually need either a carbon price or restrictions on doing all those things that hurt other people because they put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So for markets to work, you need to restrict or to impose costs on firms that are damaging other people. Remember when Nick Stern addressed the National Press Club in 2010, he drew an analogy with builders. It'd be really cheap for builders to get rid of their waste by just throwing it over the neighbour's fence. But we don't allow that. It's really cheap if you're burning coal just to let the emissions go up in the air and hurt everyone else on Earth. If you put enough of it up, you hurt a lot of people. But we don't allow people to throw a builder to reduce his costs by throwing rubbish into the neighbour's yard, and we should make people who damage others with carbon emissions pay a penalty for that. Now, or you can subsidise the competitors so that those who are throwing the waste in the air don't get as big a share of the market. So governments have to deal with the external costs imposed by carbon emissions. Government's also necessary for supporting innovation. Now, to build the zero carbon economy quickly and for the world to be zero carbon net by 2050, a lot of things are going to be happening quickly. You're not going to have zero emissions iron production in 2050 unless you've got a fair bit in 2030, and that means starting now. And we need a lot of innovation, and you don't get enough innovation fast enough unless there's public support for innovation. Economics tells you that the innovator provides benefits that the innovator herself can't capture. The first user of a technology or the first producer of a zero carbon product will make a lot of mistakes and learn a lot, but the whole world learns with them, and so they convey a benefit on the rest of the world. And that's why our business schools teach young business people you must never be the first mover with a new technology. You must be a follower so that you can learn from everyone else's mistakes. Well, we can't afford to wait for this one. We've got to get cracking. And so government has to support the first movers, the innovators, to get the new industries going. So that's the second role for government. The third role for government is in the industries we're talking about, electricity and hydrogen is going to be very important. You need some services that are provided efficiently only by a monopoly. Electricity for transmission, for example, you don't want competition there. In the suburb of Melbourne that I live in, Princes Hill, you had 6 different companies putting transmission lines down the road. Quite apart from the fact it'd be ridiculous in terms of cost, but there'd be a revolution. Bad enough having one. And they're natural monopolies, electricity transmission. And Rod Sims and I and the Superpower Institute are drawing attention to the fact there's also a natural monopoly in transport and storage of hydrogen. We need pipelines and storage facilities. If everyone does their own, you'll get unnecessary duplication and costs will be unnecessarily high. These what the economists call these types of services natural monopolies, and natural monopolies are most efficiently supplied by government. There's 3 states in Australia that have privatised their poles and wires, Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. They won't actually move as fast as the states that didn't. Queensland's setting a cracking pace and may actually emerge as one of the 2 leaders of the superpower because it's able to provide those natural monopoly services through the state companies relatively smoothly. South Australia is the other state that's setting a cracking pace. And they've got the advantage that they're all coal areas. We're in the areas where renewable energy is terrific in the Upper Spencer Gulf with this good sun and good wind. And you've already got the power lines that brought the power from the old coal power stations in Port Augusta to Adelaide. And so the renewable energy can tack on to that, and it's not such a big job there as in other places. Plus, in South Australia, you've got a government that understands very well the nature of the opportunity and is pushing things along. So they're the three essential roles of government: dealing with the external costs that those who burn fossil carbon impose on others, supporting innovation so we get enough innovation quick enough, and providing the natural monopoly services.
How much of those three platforms, Ross, broadly speaking, are achievable by creating new entities, having to create new legislation, new regulation, and how much of it is adjusting already existing infrastructure to make fit? So, for example, on a carbon price, obviously Australia has passed and repealed a carbon price, but we have the emissions reduction fund as a way of, as you say, incentivizing the competition. Our state of Victoria is reopening the State Electricity Commission and having another throwback to the 80s and 90s. How much of this relies on creating new, and how much of this can be done through leveraging what already is in place?
Well, the emissions reduction fund was Tony Abbott's fig leaf when he got rid of carbon pricing to pretend he was doing something about climate change, and it's no harm. It's a little bit of good, but it's little. It doesn't even do the job of a fig leaf. It doesn't actually cover things up. It's a pimple, and that won't get us very far. The Albanese government's done some pretty bold things. The safeguard mechanism really introduces a sort of ETS for the big emitters, and that'll be helpful. It's recently introduced a rather bold scheme called the Capacity Investment Scheme to underwrite new renewables. All of that is directed just at decarbonising what's already here. But building the superpower, exporting the goods that will allow Germany and Britain and France and Japan and Korea and China to get to zero net emissions needs much more than that. And doing much more is going to require new institutions. So we've got to lift our minds above just getting down to minus 43% by 2030 and to zero by 2050, and think of the much bigger opportunity from developing the new export industries that will require new institutions.
Well, Ross, as we come to the end of our time together, I just want to ask you one more question. So in 2011, when you presented the update on the climate change review, I remember watching the press club speech from my office, and you said that you had confidence in Australia's ability to tackle climate change because Australia isn't a pissant country. Obviously, I have never forgotten that line. I absolutely loved it. Do you still agree that Australia isn't a pissant country? And what does a brave and confident Australia look like in the future?
Well, Rachel, I still believe we're not a pissant country, although for 9 years we did our best to hide it. We did our best to conceal the fact that we're not a pissant country. But I think we're coming out of that. We've now got all state governments in Australia, coalition and Labor, supporting the superpower vision. That was true when you had Liberal-led governments in South Australia and New South Wales, and we've still got one in Tasmania. So it's not a partisan political issue at the state level. At the Commonwealth level, we've now got a Commonwealth government that's strongly supporting the superpower vision. And the crossbench, which is now very large, with Teals and Greens in the lower and upper house, very strongly committed to it, but there's still some dissent. I don't know what Barnaby Joyce was shouting into his phone when he was lying down in Braddon, but during the day when he was standing up, he was shouting about renewables being terrible. So we haven't quite got our act together across the Commonwealth level of government in Australia, but things are pretty strong in the community. They're strong at state government level. At the government and the parliament, as the majority in the parliament, are in a good place. We'll be better when we've got more of the coalition on board in the Commonwealth as well as the states. The most important thing, I think, is what the Superpower Institute is trying to do, and that's change the narrative to have more Australians understand the big role we can play. We've got extraordinary resources. We've got industrial capacity, tradition, skills that can get us started. We can make a very big difference to whether Europe and Northeast Asia gets to zero net emissions, and that's hugely important because those countries are more than 40% of world emission. And in the process, we give Australia a long period, more than a generation, of full employment with rising incomes for a growing population. Once the Australian community understands that more clearly, the vigorous, forward-looking, ambitious Australia will emerge and trample the remnants of pissant Australia in the ground.
Professor Ross Garnaut, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your conversation.
Thanks. Nice talking to you, Rachel.
Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.